Disconnected letters, the Quran's combinatorial miracle. The Quran has been criticized for its repetitions since the day it was revealed. Critics, who have questioned the divine source of the text throughout history, have described these repetitions as a disadvantage or even a flaw for a divine text. Sometimes they have argued that the text is a product of man, with claims such as forgetfulness and lack of foundation. In traditional Islamic interpretations, these repetitions are generally explained as a requirement of the Quran's own unique literary style. However, a deeper look claims that there may be a much more different, perhaps centuries-old but unnoticed, multi-layered mystery behind these repetitions. In this study, we will deal with an interesting and groundbreaking theory that focuses not only on what the Quran says, but also on how it is said. This theory goes on to point out that the Quran is actually a structural miracle and a potential divine engineering signature that works in the depths of the Quran by establishing a secret connection between the repetitions in the Quran and the letters. In order to understand our theory better, we would like to bring up an issue related to our theory first. The Quran often refers to a specific topic. It asks the reader questions in the name of understanding the verse. However, it gives its answer and explanation much later, sometimes after dozens of surahs, in a completely different context and in a completely different place. Let's summarize this structure with a few examples. Surah Fatiha, verse 6. Convey us to the right path. When we ask what the right path is, the answer comes to us after two surahs. Surah Ali Imran, verse 351. Allah is my Lord and your Lord, so serve Him. This is the right path. Surah Fatiha, verse 4. He is the owner of the Judgment Day. Question: what does the Judgment Day mean? The answer is again unforgettable. After Surah 81, Infitar 18:19 is clarified in its verses. Yes, do you know what Judgment Day is? On that day, no one will touch anyone. On that day, all decisions belong only to Allah. Fatiha Surah, verse 2. Praise is to Allah, the Lord of the universe. When we ask about this verse, what is the Lord of the universes? 25 surahs after the Fatiha Surah, in verses 23-24 of the Shura Surah, our question is answered in the dialogue between Pharaoh and Moses. Pharaoh asks, what is the Lord of the universes? Moses, if you will absolutely believe, He is the Lord of the heavens, the earth, and those between them. This and similar hundreds of examples show that the Quran has a conscious, planned, and deep integrity, far from forgetfulness and randomness. On the other hand, there are also clear and frequently repeated expressions in the Quran. The phrase, "We have made the Quran easy for a message. Does anyone take admonition?" repeated every 4 or 5 verses in the Surah Al-Qamar, or the phrase, "Which of the blessings of your Lord can you deny?" repeated 31 times every 2 verses in the Surah Ar-Rahman, are examples of this. A mind free of prejudices should ask the following critical question at this point. While the author of the text has the ability to connect and answer to each other without forgetting even the finest detail in hundreds of verses in completely different surahs, and has the ability to plan, he overlooked and forgot the expressions that repeat in the same text with 1 verse in between. At this point, the theory we will deal with comes into play and gives a brave answer to this question. The theory's claim is clear. These repetitions in the Quran are definitely not a flaw, a forgetfulness, or a literary weakness. On the contrary, it is the product of a highly conscious, carefully planned design based on profound wisdom. And at the heart of this theory lies perhaps one of the most mysterious and most pondered elements of the Quran, Huruf al-Muqatta'a, or the mysterious groups of letters known as the cut letters. At the beginning of the 29th surah of the Qur'an, there are specific groups of letters such as Alif Lam Mim, Ha Mim, Yasin, and Taha. The term Huruf al-Muqatta'a means cut letters or separate letters. 14 of the 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet are chosen, and 14 different combinations are placed in groups of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with a total of 14 different combinations at the beginning of chapter 29 as one verse. These letters are written in a unified way like a word, but each is pronounced separately. These letters are written together as a single word, but each is pronounced separately. For example, while Alif Lam Mim is written together, it is read syllable by syllable, letter by letter, as Alif Lam Mim. To give an English example, they are verses that are written together like QRS, but read syllable by syllable like QRS, which do not form a meaningful word when placed side by side, but rather appear more like a symbol or code. For centuries, in the tradition of Islamic science, interpreters, linguists, linguistics, historians, and mathematicians have developed innumerable interpretations and theories on the meaning and function of these cut letters. But a generally accepted theory has not been put there. These approaches can be summarized as follows. The first view is the key to the surahs. Some scholars have argued that the names of the surahs in which these letters are found represent the main subject or content. The second view points to divine names and secrets. This common view is that the letters refer to the names of Allah, their attributes, or only to the mysterious secrets and cosmic codes that He can know. The third view is the numerical and abjadi comments, the 19 miracles. In particular, some modern researchers have claimed that the letters have a mathematical structure based on their abjadi values. In this context, the 19 miracle theory proposed by the Caliph Rashad is the most well-known example of these numerical interpretations. Although we recommend that you study the 19 codes separately from other theories, we think that the sign of these letters is not limited to the 19 codes. Because the Qur'an says that the letter Muqatta'a has more than one sign, and in some verses where these letters take place, these letters are the signs of the book. We think that one of these signs, our theory, is discovery. Previously, we have shown with examples that the Qur'anic verses interpret each other as a book that explains itself. This is the first and fundamental layer in understanding the Qur'an. The explanation of a verse is usually found in another verse directly or indirectly. However, there is a much deeper second layer in our methodology of understanding the Qur'an. The answers to some questions and concepts have been carefully distributed into many different surahs, such as pieces of a piece of cloth. You cannot find a missing definition or list in a single verse. Instead, when you bring all the verses related to the subject together and read it comprehensively, only the general picture becomes clear, and the complete and perfect definition of the Qur'an on that subject emerges. This fragmented but comprehensive explanation method is a unique feature of the Qur'an. It removes the reader from being a passive receiver, makes him an active researcher and builder of meaning, invites you to a reading, thinking, and connecting activity that surrounds the whole book.
Well, if we apply the same systematic methodology to the subject of the letter Muqatta'a, that is, when we bring together the verses containing these cut letters, what do we see in the holistic picture in front of us? The answer is combination. As we have emphasized before, the common point about the conjunction of letters, which has been discussed with different interpretations and theories for centuries, is that these letters represent a combinational structure in their essence. So why don't we accept the conjunction of letters, and therefore its combinational structure, as a sign and trace such a combinational structure in the Quran?
The disconnected letters are the key to the Quran's combinational architecture.
Just as the alphabets are composed of 14 basic letters, and between themselves Alif, Lam, Mim, Ha, Mim, Ta, Sin, Mim, Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad, if verses are produced with different letter combinations, we suggest that the same logic is also applied in the construction of hundreds of verses of the Quran on a much wider scale. These mysterious letters almost whisper to us that, look, with the limited number of basic units, i.e. letters, how meaningful verses have been created in the form of combinations of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. The same logic and design principle applies to the sentences, expressions, and blocks of meaning in this divine book. In other words, certain basic sentence patterns and meaning expressions throughout the Quran are used as building blocks, such as the letters of the letter Muqatta'a. In one verse, the sentences A and B pass separately with different sentences, while in another verse, these sentences A and B combine to create a completely new and meaningful verse C. This is a huge linguistic Lego system hidden in the text, or a combinatorial sequence of meanings. This combinational structure of the Quran is not limited to the rearrangement of the sentences in the singular verses alone. At the same time, the addition of the subordinate verses to this combinational structure shows an order and complexity that exceeds the human mind and literary capacity. This is a very strong proof that the text is created with a complex, planned, and calculated system that cannot be written randomly or naturally. In addition to singular verses, the fact that subordinate verses are produced in groups in this way clearly reveals that the design we are facing is a conscious and superior order. When we look at the history of literature, scientific texts, or any human-made literary work, we do not come across with an example where sentences are reorganized with such a systematic combination and create meaningful and consistent new sets at each time. In particular, we do not come across with an example where a combination of 4 separate sentences, it is almost an impossible literary success for the production of the human mind to take place separately as independent elements and to be reused in a unified form in a different context and with a message. However, the Quran is the only book that shows this incomparable combinational structure in a stable way for hundreds of verses. Moreover, the Quran is not limited to only 4 or 5 sentence combinations, 10, 15, and even up to 30 sentences in length. There are passages in which the consecutive verses come together and combine to gain completely new meanings, emphasis, and connections. Each combination of these combinations, while independently carrying a valuable meaning in its own context, it creates a brand new layer of meaning and depth of message in unity. This is a feature that can only be explained with a divine arrangement and engineering, which is completely separate from the human-made natural writing styles and literary traditions of the Quran. What makes this similar structure even more admirable is that each sentence of these multiple verse groups is constructed through sentences that are taken from other corners of the Quran and are functional in their original connections. For example, let's assume that a passage consisting of 4 multiple verses contains a total of 15 sentences. Each of these 15 sentences can be found in different parts of the book, in different surahs. When we think that these expressions exist independently and that these expressions are brought together with a conscious, concise design to form a new meaning set, it turns out that this order is impossible to form with a random writing process. In the history of literature, in scientific texts, or in any human-made work, there is no example of a combinational structure in which even 4 sentences are reused in different sections in the same text. The Quran shows this incomparable and complex order in an exceptional way. This situation clearly shows that the Quran is not only in terms of meaning and message, but also in terms of structure and architecture, an incomparable and divine design. At this point, it is necessary to ask the following question.
How does this combinational structure, which does not meet any human-made work and leaves the human mind helpless, appear in the Quran in such a frequent, systematic, and flawless way? This order, which exceeds the human mind and literary capacity, once again confirms that the Quran is both a content and a miracle that cannot be imitated in terms of structure. This is proof that the Quran is not only a message and guidance book, but also a divine design marvel with its structural perfection and mathematical linguistic architecture, linguistic Lego pieces and divine engineering. According to this model, around 700 to 800 verses in the Quran have been produced with combinations of a previously determined series of sentence patterns, expression groups, and meaning units, i.e., building blocks, and thus the verses created have been distributed and hidden throughout the Quran as if they were a puzzle. Huruf al-Muqatta'a and its combinational structure see a sign, a tip, a prototype, and a key operation presented to us by the author of the book to discover this huge combinational verse system.
These basic sentence patterns and expression groups see operations such as bricks of a building or linguistic Lego pieces with a modern resemblance. Each building block is meaningful in its own way, but each time it is brought together in a different order with a different combination, creating a new message, a unique emphasis, a deepening meaning layer, or a different connection. Thus, almost an infinite number of building blocks are created from a limited number of fundamental units. Just as in an architectural structure, the same bricks can be combined in different shapes and patterns to build countless different buildings. The Quran clearly demonstrates that it is based on a conscious, calculated, and purposeful combinational design, with infinite richness in meaning and message layers derived from a limited number of basic linguistic units. This situation reveals the reality of a divine engineering and linguistic architecture that transcends the limits of human language and literature thanks to the Quran's components that can be rearranged, combined, and separated. Unlimited diversity and a universal divine signature. This structural feature of the Quran can be interpreted as a manifestation of the creation logic that we can observe in the whole universe in terms of language and text. The first analogy is the DNA sample. Our DNA only has a limited alphabet consisting of 4 different nucleotide bases, i.e., adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. However, the different combinations and sequences of these 4 letters produce the enormous diversity and complexity of millions of living species on Earth. The second analogy is the software language example. All digital world and complex computer programs are actually built with different combinations of a basic alphabet consisting of only zeros and ones, i.e., binary codes. DNA and software language analogies support the idea that the Quran also creates an unlimited variety and depth of meaning from a limited number of linguistic elements. It is possible to compare the text with the flexible, efficient, and productive structures in both biological and technological systems. Thus, this structural order of the Quran gives man a universal and divine signature, which indicates the infinite diversity and order seen in all areas of the existing world far beyond an ordinary literary text. The cleverly, intricately, and wisely established combinations of the selected linguistic Lego pieces allow the Quran to create an infinite universe of meaning and depth of message from the limited number of words and expressions of the Quran. Verses about the limitlessness of the divine word. This combinational structure of the Quran and the variety of meanings it produces are in harmony with the verses about its limitlessness.
In Surah Al-Kahf, verse 109, it is stated as follows, "Say, if the ocean is a mixture for the words of my Lord, and even if we add that much, the ocean will be exhausted before the words of my Lord are exhausted." In Surah Luqman 31:27, this truth is expressed as follows, "Even if all the trees on earth are pens, even if 7 seas are added to the seas and a mixture is made, the words of Allah will not be exhausted. Undoubtedly, Allah has absolute power and wisdom." These verses point to the limitlessness of the Quran's literal and meaningful richness, depth, and diversity, indicating that the combinational structure is like a mechanism that makes this possible physically and structurally, reading with a structural miracle and a scientific purpose. In this respect, the Quran is a miraculous work not only with its meaningful and spiritual dimension, but also with its structural, formal, and architectural dimension, as a design process that exceeds the human mind. The function of Huruf al-Muqatta'a appears here as a kind of key or code-solving guide. These letter groups are a sign, a guide that helps us find the door to the combinational design of a mystery that seems to be superficially unsolvable and incomprehensible. By placing these letters in the text, Allah makes us feel that the Quran is not only a traditional moral, jurisprudent, or spiritual text, but also a time has come to read, examine, and contemplate it with a structural, formative, design, and even a scientific approach. Because the principle of combination, by calling the combinatorial field, which is basically a mathematical discipline, and the structural system analysis, it implies that the text contains a scientific, architectural, and mathematical order that is planned to deepen beyond the human mind and the human literary capacity.
Thanks to this clue, it is understood that the Quran was designed with a linguistic construction process, an engineering meticulousness, and that each word, each sentence, and each expression took place within a conscious and purposeful architectural plan. Thus, the Quran carries both the meaning and the layers of the human thought beyond traditional religious commentaries and literal interpretation. Now the question is not only what the Quran tells us, but also the question of how the Quran builds this message and text with a structure and engineering. And this opens up a whole new field of discovery that strengthens faith and expands the horizon of contemplation. The common ground between these disciplines will definitely give a new meaning and depth to the discovery of the structural secrets and linguistic miracles of the Quran. The effect of the combinational design on the translation and the need for consistent translation. Another important result of this combinational and structural miracle of the Quran is its effect on the translation and translation issue. Those who compare the Quran to the original Arabic, read it carefully, or translate it, clearly realize that some verses are repeated in different surahs in exactly the same way, with the same words. However, it is seen that these verses are translated in different translations or in different places of the same translation with different words, different expressions, or with fine meanings. The main reason for this situation is that the Quran does not pay enough attention to this combinational design and the twofold or doublefold structure, that is, the 23rd verse of Surah Al-Zumar, and that it is neglected in the translation process. This inevitably hinders the reader from noticing the internal consistency of the book, its structural integrity, and the fine connections between the verses. This combinational and binary design of the Quran is based on the conscious repetition of the same expressions in different surahs. This situation is a reflection of the divine beauty, consistency, and flawlessness of the Quran. Surah Az-Zumar, verse 23, expresses this situation as follows: Allah has revealed the most beautiful of words as a book of double or multiple layers, which contains wisdom and judgments. In addition, in the verse of Surah An-Nisa, verse 82, it points to this consistency. Do they still not think of the Quran well? If it had come from someone other than Allah, they would undoubtedly find many contradictions in it. When this divine order and consistency are overlooked during the translation process, the structural integrity of the book is damaged, and it becomes difficult for the reader to realize this fine and meaningful connection between the verses, the repetitions, and therefore the combinational miracle. This combinational and binary design of the Quran is based on the conscious repetition of the same expressions in different surahs. This situation is a reflection of the divine beauty, consistency, and flawlessness of the Quran. Surah Az-Zumar, verse 23, expresses this situation as follows: Allah has revealed the most beautiful of words as a book of double or multiple layers, which contains wisdom and judgments. In addition, in the verse of Surah An-Nisa, verse 82, it points to this consistency. Do they still not think of the Quran well? If it had come from someone other than Allah, they would undoubtedly find many contradictions in it. When this divine order and consistency are overlooked during the translation process, the structural integrity of the book is damaged, and it becomes difficult for the reader to realize this fine and meaningful connection between the verses, the repetitions, and therefore the combinational miracle.
The repeated expressions are placed not randomly, but as a conscious design requirement. Translators should keep this structure in mind, turn the repeated verses and sentence patterns with accuracy and consistency. The combinational design of the Quran is reflected in the translation of all the verses, which allows the reader to understand the book in a more comprehensive and deeper way. The same expression is translated in different places in the same way, which makes it easy for the reader to notice this connection and reveals the internal structure of the text. This situation clearly reveals that the systematic and consistent structure of the text comes from a humanistic source by showing the divine order and imperfection of the Quran. It is more clearly understood with consistent translations that the repetitions are not a human error or a literary defect, but a conscious and wise divine design, and therefore offers a strong defense against criticism.
If we summarize, this tremendous combinational structure in the Quran is not only a feature that should be taken into account and carefully protected, not only in the original Arabic text, but also in the translation process. The consistent translation of the repeated verses and expressions will accurately convey the Quran's structural integrity, literary miracle, and universal message to the reader. This approach offers a strong evidence that critics claim that repetitions are a human error, while the reader is more likely to understand the message and structure of the Quran more clearly, more profoundly, and more admirably. The structural call of the Quran, the call to the human mind and heart. The Quran has been a sacred text that has been a guide to Muslim societies throughout history. However, unfortunately, the original message of the Quran and its unparalleled structural miracles have sometimes been shaded. Cultural elements, local traditions, and sources other than the Quran have played a more dominant role in the formation and understanding of religion. As a result, many Muslim societies have been surrounded by superstitions and baseless acceptances and have deviated from the guidance of God, and have been left out of the scientific, philosophical, and intellectual progress in the critical periods of history. However, the Quran contains a miraculous work that invites people to question, to think deeply, that is, to contemplate and understand, both in words and in structure. The combinational design of the Quran and the Huruf al-Muqatta'a reveals that this divine text is not only a linguistic and literary miracle in the traditional sense, but also a great engineering and architecture that moves the mind, makes people think and research. This structure encourages man to discover the deep structural messages and divine wisdom of the Quran beyond its superficial readings and ready interpretations. The Quran directly addresses the human mind and heart and aims at these things. The first aim is the invitation to understanding and understanding. This combinational and intertwined structure of the Quran emphasizes the importance of understanding it not only through traditional interpretations or secondary interpretations, but through its own original language and structure. This correct and effective reading makes it possible for the individual to perceive the message personally, to understand it, and to live his religious understanding in a lively and dynamic way, free from superstitions and rigid dogmas. The second aim is the signs that lead to scientific thinking and research. The Quran is not a physical or biological book. However, with the examples it gives, the similarities it makes, and the evidence it points to, it encourages the mental angel, observation, and scientific thinking. It invites the human mind to observe the universe, to research the laws of nature, to discover the subtleties and secrets of creation. The following verses in the Quran support this idea. The first scientific sign is the expansion of the universe. We have built the sky with our own hands, and we will expand it. Zariyat 51:47. The second scientific sign is the geological operation of the mountains. We created fixed mountains on earth so that they wouldn't shake. Prophets 21:31. The third scientific sign is the gradual development of the embryo. Then we made the sperm drop into an alaka, i.e. a hanging and holding zygote cell ball. Mu'minun 23:14. The fourth scientific sign is the water cycle and botany. It is the one that brings down water from the sky. We finished all kinds of plants with it. An'am 6:99. This and similar hundreds of verses show that the Quran illuminates the scientific discoveries, confirms them, and leads man to constant search for knowledge, learning, and research. The Quran almost calls humanity to the doors of science and rational thinking, saying, "Read my verses in the universe, that is, my signs. Observe the art, power, and wisdom of the Creator. Say, look at what is in the heavens and on the earth. Think." Yunus 10:101. The third purpose is to build a society that is peaceful with science and reason. The final message of the Quran is not only to invite people to an individual and spiritual journey, but also to encourage them to understand life, the universe, and themselves better through reason, science, observation, and research, and to build a more just and virtuous society. This understanding should lead Muslim societies to a peaceful life with knowledge, wisdom, philosophy, and technology, and should make them the pioneers and carriers of scientific and technological advances as they have been in history. While the miraculous structure and inspiration of the Quran encourages people to think, question, learn, and produce, it creates a solid foundation for us to understand the infinite power, knowledge, and creativity of Allah. A call to turn to the Quran. This combinational design of the Quran, its structural miracle, and its age-old divine message provide an endless source of thought, contemplation, inspiration, and discovery to humanity. In order for Muslim societies and all humanity to fully understand this unique message and miracle, we must move away from myths, imitations, and narrow patterns. It is necessary to turn to the Quran again and again, to read it by understanding it in their own languages, to think deeply about it, and to build an inner life with science, reason, and virtue. The Quran is not only a book of worship and prayer, but also an everlasting and eternal divine guide that invites people to think, question, research, and discover the secrets of the universe. This miraculous structure and message offers a brighter, more just, more peaceful, and more advanced future to humanity by making everyone who seeks, all Muslims and the truth, return to the essence and original message of the Quran, reconciling with reason and science, and trying to understand the verses in the Quran and the Kaaba in the Book of Allah. For this reason, we invite the experts of the subject, scientists, linguists, engineers, mathematicians, programmers, and all readers who intend to discover this truth to look at the Quran from a combinational point of view in light of this theoretical framework and physical examples we offer, to examine this system in more detail, to test it, to think about it, to develop it, and to move it further. Thus, altogether, by discovering this profound and awesome awakening order in the language and structure of the Quran, we may have taken an important step to better understand the divine message, wisdom, and greatness of the book.